Morning, everyone. We'll get started in a couple minutes. We'll give folks a chance to filter into the meeting. So hang on for a few more minutes and then we'll get things started. Thank you. Okay, it looks like the pace of attendees has started to slow down. So I think we'll go ahead and get things started this morning. So good morning to everybody and thanks for participating today. My name is Mike Watt. I am one of the deputy directors here at San Diego County APCD. So again, appreciate your time and joining us this morning. The purpose of the meeting today is to provide some background on the district's emissions inventory program and solicit some feedback from you all on a proposed revisions to District Rule 40 related to fees to help recover the district's costs associated with implementing the emissions inventory program. We've got some folks here today with the team to kind of help support us and help answer any questions that may come up. So we've got my colleague, Miney Luther, who's a deputy director for our engineering and compliance division. We've got Mohsen Nazemi, who's our chief of engineering, Stephanie Nicholas, who's our chief of support services, and Jonia Lofgren, who's our senior engineer for the emissions inventory team. So everyone's here to provide some context and help answer some questions today. If we can go to the next slide, please. So here's a brief outline of what we'll be talking about today. First, we'll provide an overview of the district's emissions inventory program and review some of the recent changes in state requirements that have really expanded the number of facilities and pollutants that are required to be inventoried. Then we'll walk through the proposal for recovering costs associated with the program implementation, talk about the proposed timeline and next steps, and finally open it up for questions and feedback that you all may have, which is really kind of the main intent of the discussion today is to hear thoughts and questions and ideas from the group. So with that, I will now turn it over to Jonia Lofgren, who will be walking us through the district's emissions inventory program and providing some additional details. So next slide, please.
Thanks, Mike. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. Like Mike said, I am Jonia Lofgren, Senior Engineer for the Toxics and Emissions Inventory Group here at the district. I'll go over a little bit of the background on emissions inventory and then some of the recent changes, like Mike said. So to start, local air districts are required to inventory criteria and toxic emissions from facilities within their jurisdiction. This is per federal, state, and local rules and regulations. Our district rule 19.3 is the rule which implements these mandates. The information that we receive through these programs, both the federal and state programs, provide us with information for our regulatory programs and for the public. The data that is submitted helps us understand the sources of emissions that may contribute to adverse health effects, as well as other impacts at the local, regional, and statewide level. So in recent years, the California Air Resources Board, also known as CARB, has amended their regulations significantly. They've required more data, calculations, and facilities to enter the programs, which I will cover in later slides. So to accommodate these amendments and ensure that the state mandates are met, the district has amended our own rule, District Rule 19.3, and we've made enhancements to our emissions inventory system, which is also known as EIS. So before these regulations were amended, the district's emission inventory program would normally inventory roughly 200 facilities every year. Next slide, please. So this slide kind of outlines the reporting programs a facility may be applicable to. The first is the criteria emissions inventory, also known as CEI. This applies to any facility which emits more than 5 tons per year of VOCs and or NOx. The second one that you see on the slide is the toxic emissions inventory, which implements CARB's hotspots program. This program is applicable to facilities which emit certain toxic air contaminants. The last one that you see on the slide is the criteria pollutant and toxic emissions reporting, also known as CTR. This is also a CARB program and applies to any facilities under the general applicability of the CTR regulation. That includes facilities which are applicable to the greenhouse gas reporting rule, high-risk facilities, and or facilities which emit high amounts of criteria emissions. Like I had mentioned previously, the district has historically inventoried about 200 of these facilities every year. These are usually large facilities with multiple emission units and lots of permitted equipment. Okay, next slide, please. So in response to state mandates, the district has and will be required to greatly expand both the number of stationary sources in the program, but also the number of pollutants that we are required to quantify and the amount of data collected. Per facilities or part of these programs, both CTR and AB 2588 were amended to require emission calculations for new toxic air contaminants. So for data year 2022, we added roughly 250 new pollutants. And then by data year 2026, we will have to add another about 780 additional pollutants to our emission inventories. Another amendment is that under CTR, for those under general applicability, there are new data requirements such as reporting portable diesel engines, stack specifications, location information. There's really like a whole list that's been amended for CTR. So as these data requirements and calculations increase, the sources need to ensure that they only submit more data, but then that we're compliant with the new amended regulations as well. So next slide, please. So here are some of the emission inventory program enhancements that have been made because of these amended regulations. So due to the increased requirements, the district has not only had to expand the resources, which include additional staff, but we've also adjusted EIS to accommodate increased reporting. First, the district amended Rule 19.3 to require submission through the EIS portal, which streamlined the data submittal process. This significantly reduced the amount of time spent hand entering data that was previously received by paper submissions. Next, enhancements were required to accommodate the new data requirements in EIS, such as adding the new pollutants, calculation methods, and the new data requirements for the amended CTR. These adjustments have been phased in over the last 2 years. We hosted multiple webinars, we developed user guides and help videos, and those are posted on our website for use currently. And then lastly, we did apply for and were awarded a one-time grant funding from the EPA to help offset some of the emission inventory program costs. Okay, next slide, please. So looking ahead, the amendments to CTR will continue to phase in facilities into the emission inventory program until data year 2026. When at that time, it is expected that all the facilities will start reporting annually. So as seen on the top here, through these phase-in requirements, roughly 4,500 new facilities will enter the emission inventory program and require annual inventories starting data year 2026. This slide projects how many permits will enter the program during each phase-in year. Many of the facilities that are going to enter into these phases are much smaller compared to the ones we're already inventorying. They usually have just 1 or 2 permits. And I think that's it for this slide.
Great, thank you, Johnny. I appreciate kind of walking through some of those changes and the big growth in the program that's sort of you know, spurring this effort. So, currently the district doesn't have a dedicated revenue source to recover costs associated with these existing and new emission inventory requirements. So as such, we're recommending the implementation of a phased approach towards helping to recover some of these costs. We've looked at labor data for facilities that have historically been inventoried. As Johnny mentioned, those are typically the larger facilities that have multiple emission units, things like power plants, larger coating operations, landfills, asphalt manufacturing operations, things of that nature. And due to the size and complexity of those facilities, the time it takes to evaluate emission data can fluctuate pretty significantly based on the type of permit and the quality of data that's submitted, which make it pretty challenging to establish a fixed fee that aligns with the requirements in state law for recovering those costs. So as a result, what we're proposing is to implement a fee to be effective on January 1 to recover the costs incurred by the district to prepare or revise these emissions inventory reports for these more complex facilities based on actual time and materials costs associated with that work for each specific facility. And then, as Jonia mentioned, the facilities that are kind of phasing in as part of the CTR regulations are typically smaller facilities, things like engines, gas stations, automotive coating operations. They typically have fewer permits and less complex information. Since they're phasing in, we're still in the process of that phase in. We'll gather additional labor data on those facilities and have a better idea of how much time it takes to prepare their emission inventory reports, which, as Johnny mentioned, we anticipate will have a little less fluctuation and complexity compared to the larger facilities based on the nature of their equipment. And so because of that, our intent is to evaluate the potential to implement a fixed fee for those smaller facilities for fiscal year 26-27 to recover those costs as we have more labor data to kind of assess what that looks like. Next slide, please. In terms of the plan and next steps, the goal is to bring this emissions inventory fee proposal to our governing board on September 12th, together with our normal, fiscal year 25-26 fee revisions as part of a public hearing to solicit additional feedback and input on these proposed revisions to Rule 40. We're currently working on finalizing the proposed fiscal year 25-26 fee revisions and a notice with information on those proposed revisions that will be discussed as part of that September meeting will be mailed out to permit holders and posted on the website in advance of that discussion. Following that meeting on September 12th, the plan is to then bring the proposal and, based on feedback that we receive at this meeting and the September meeting, to the governing board for their consideration of adoption on November 14th, is the date of that second meeting. And then if the board adopts these revisions in November, these new emissions inventory fees would become effective on January 1, and the remaining fee revisions would take effect at the start of the new fiscal year on July 1, 2025. Next slide, please. So with that, we really want to open it up for any questions, comments, or feedback that you all may have. We'd like you to use the raise hand feature in Zoom, so we can kind of call on folks, and then if there are questions in the chat, we'll try to keep an eye on those as well and respond. If we're not able to get to any things today, we certainly will provide responses after the fact. And then if you don't have questions today, or if you have other questions that come up after the workshop, we can always email things to us via the email on the screen, apcdfiscal@sdapcd.org, or the QR code there is a link to our rule development website where you can find workshop notices and information and things of that nature. So really want to open it up and hear any comments or questions that the group may have. So we'll go ahead and do that. Okay, I see a hand raised, Bill Royce. Looks like you've unmuted yourself, Bill, but I'm not sure. We're not hearing anything. Still not hearing anything from Bill. Maybe we can come back to him um, as questions come up. Jack Monger, looks like your hand is up.
There we go. Didn't want to make the same mistake Bill's making with my unmute myself.
All right, we can hear you.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Johnny, for the presentation. As always, IEA appreciates the effort that the district puts into bringing these workshops out in a timely fashion and welcomes the discussion and feedback. So wanted to begin my comments with that remark. I guess I would like to start with a real fundamental question on the issue, and that is a lot of IEA companies have facilities in other air districts around California. And it's my understanding that San Diego is the only district that takes on the burden of performing the emission calculations for each facility in the region. A task that obviously, as you've pointed out, is going to increase substantially here in the near future as the CTR calculations goes into effect in 2027. So our question is, why has San Diego APCD chosen to continue this practice when so many other districts, South Coast included, opt to have facilities prepare and submit their emission calculations for review by the district? I guess like what's the justification for the district to continue to invest in the enormous amount of time and expense required in preparing these emission calculations when so many other districts seem to have found it more cost effective to put that responsibility on the specific facilities to submit. So I've got some follow-on questions to that, but I'll stop right there just in case you have some feedback to that remark.
Yeah, maybe I'll ask Jonya or Miney if they can speak to that particular question.
Sure, thanks, Mike. Miney, I can jump in if you'd like, and then maybe you can add on. Thanks, Jack, for your question. I think we've had kind of similar discussions, not in terms of fees, of course, but related to emissions inventory and how it's been done in San Diego in the past, how we're currently doing it, and how we hope to do it in the future. So currently, just for everyone's knowledge, we collect information through our emissions inventory system. And in that system are pre-selected calculation methods. So currently the system does the calculations for us and then we review. You are correct. Other districts do collect completed calculations from facilities and then review them. But the review is similar. Other districts also have pre-selected calculation methods, not in a system like ours, but they're pre-chosen and then they also review those. So they kind of have a combination of both. But in your reference to South Coast, that is correct. They do collect them and then review them. But in the past, before EIS was required in 19.3, there was a history of the district taking raw data and completing calculations. More by hand is probably the good description. That is no longer done. The costs that are going to come out from time and materials will reflect the efficiencies that have been made in EIS with the pre-selected calculation methods. Now, during the submittal process, any facility can go into their EIS account, of course, report their data, and then change the calculation methods accordingly as well, essentially reporting their own calculations. But ultimately, we will review and evaluate those, and those will be part of the T&M costs.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I guess I would ask you the big difference we see between this process in other districts with the system they use versus San Diego's system is that there is way less back and forth in South Coast and other districts between the district and the facility in terms of working through questions about the data, adjustments that need to be made, justifications for what was submitted, that sort of thing. For whatever reason, it's a huge difference doing things in San Diego as far as the back and forth is concerned and the need for that. I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's because the system that others have chosen to use somehow provides more confidence from the district that what they're getting is useful and is understood. I just don't know what it is, but what I see, or I guess that what that leads us to be concerned about is even greater back and forth, the need for back and forth between facility and the district, and going to the cost, the labor cost that it costs both the facility and the district is enormous and very, very different from one to the other. So we look at these costs every year. We really don't have any issue with all of the other annual increases that the district has been required to impose over the last couple of years because of the audit and the results from there. And we appreciate the fact that the district is going to be looking at these costs annually and making the increases, because price of everything goes up. We know that as well as everybody does. But as we look now at this particular open-ended time and materials with a known amount of additional back and forth, it's very concerning that it's going to get expensive, and we don't have any. It's the unknown. That's what makes it so tough for businesses. Is what is this really going to cost?
And I appreciate this question because, EIS has developed a lot in the last couple of years. I can project on why South Coast is the way that they are. Although we, in the development of EIS, I have met with South Coast and talked specifically about, of course, their AER program. Their program has been in place for more than a decade at this point. They've worked out a lot of kinks, but due to the new or previous data requirements, which are now being implemented in EIS, many of the facilities here in San Diego, are unfamiliar with the data requirements from these programs, both for the amendments, but the previous existing as well, just because of the way that we're now collecting the data. So there has been back and forth to make sure that the data that's coming through is complete and accurate per the mandates for federal and state regulations. But I think we've talked about the efficiencies of EIS, that once those are built into EIS, once that historical data is there, we really do hope the back and forth is less because it's been established, similar to South Coast AER program. When they were establishing AER as well, learning from South Coast and some of the issues that they also had issues with collecting, the correct data at that time. So the hope is that as we and the facilities become more familiar with this data and it's in EIS, that back and forth is less.
Thanks, John. Yeah, if I could just follow in with one other comment, Mike, and then I'll shut up for a minute, let everybody else chime in. Is that okay?
Yes, please, Jeff.
Okay. Thanks for that comment, John. You appreciate that. I guess to take it a step further, the anxiety created by anything that's time and materials, if you've ever had to deal with a contractor or any sort of project and knowing you're just stuck on time and materials without any kind of estimate, it just really is a challenge. And that's what's got a lot of my members very, very concerned, particularly when I guess the proposal for $300 an hour for staff time, which, by the way, it seems to be exceedingly high. If you look at what the other staff rates are for the Department of Environmental Quality and Health at the county, running in the ranges between 180 and 260 an hour at the high end. At the high end, I guess is a little actually over 300, but that's for the actual participation from the county vet. Everybody else, all the scientists, all the technicians, price out way below 300. And so we're concerned about the open-endedness of time and materials, and we're concerned about the $300 staff time as seemingly higher than anybody else is charging. I couldn't find any of my consultants that charge $300 an hour. So just as a comparison. So I'll stop the comment there and let others chime in.
Oh, thank you, Jack, and we appreciate those concerns, and certainly when it comes to T&M and kind of the uncertainty surrounding those invoices, I think there are opportunities for us to maybe consider ways that we can work on that and provide, maybe some estimates based on previous years' labor data, or even look at opportunities to answer questions throughout the process if folks want an update on what the bill is totaling up at that point in time. And in terms of the labor rate itself, as you're aware, that rate includes direct staff time and district-wide overhead and department overhead, but it is something that we can look at in terms of making sure that we're clear to folks about what goes into that rate and how it works. And as Jonya alluded to in her presentation, we're always looking at ways to try to maximize efficiencies. EIS is a good example of that, and anywhere where we can try to reduce some of those costs are things that we're consistently looking at going forward. So appreciate the feedback there and the thoughts and comments, and definitely something that we can look at to try to help make things as clear and open as possible so that folks have an understanding what costs they'll be looking at incurring. Wanted to open it up for any other questions. Oh, most of it looks like you've got, wasn't sure if
Yeah,
most of them had something
I
to
just
add.
wanted to follow up on Jonia's comments, and thank you, Jack, for your comments. Coming from South Coast, I think it might be helpful to add some background there. When I was there, and we did have the system that AER that Jonia was referring to, where facilities would calculate their own emissions and report it to the district. Each year we had to go through a significant amount of resources to audit the data that has been submitted. And obviously with, South Coast had thousands of sources, we were not able to audit everybody. So we would take a percentage each year. And the outcome that we found was there were significant discrepancies when we audited the calculations. So one of the benefits of having the district do this is that we would do it consistently. And as Johnny mentioned, if a facility has different source of information, like they've done their own source test or anything like that, we definitely would encourage and agree and accept those as valid data so they can supply that. But part of it is actually it creates more consistency when we do the calculation, and it provides for more accurate data. So just wanted to add that up as in addition to what Johnny mentioned.
Thank you, Mosen.
Thanks, Mosen. I wanted to take a minute. There's a couple questions in the chat from Mr. Royce. I tried to reply in my response, but the question regarding the nature of the fee, and as we discussed, it at this point the proposal is a time and materials fee, so it'll be based on actual time charged. If there's questions from folks about whether or not your facility would be subject based on the proposal, that's something that we can certainly help follow up with and kind of respond on a one-on-one basis. If you want that information, you can send us that email. But generally, as Jonya said, this initial phase would apply to those larger facilities that have historically been part of the program. And then I wasn't sure, Jonya or somebody on the team, he had a question about if there's a list of the pollutants that we can share, or maybe that's already available on our website.
Sure. So there's multiple sources for that. If you are already reporting in EIS, we suggest the best source is EIS because we have the pollutants that are required by data you're in there currently. But if you don't have access to EIS, these are coming from the amended regulations. So the source of that data and the best reference would be CARB's hotspots regulation. Appendix A lists all of the pollutants that will be entering the program or have entered the program. We also do have a list on our website, which I can put the link in the chat here for too. So there's multiple sources for that information.
Yeah, I was going to suggest if you can add it to the chat, Johnny. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Jonya. I see Neil Davenport. I see that you turned your camera on. I wasn't sure if you had a question or comment.
I do. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Two-part question. I'm not super familiar with Rule 40, but is what you're considering for time and material costs, will this be in addition to what appear to be air contaminant emission fees that already exist? Are you considering replacing existing fees related to emissions? That's question number one. And the second question is, again, I'm not an expert on this, but I believe other air districts, I mean, they have permit fees, emission fees. Bay Area, if I'm right, actually combines them. So do you look at fees you're collecting for permitting as separate and serving a different purpose? It would seem like this whole initiative should consider other sources of revenue to the district related to emission sources. And is that going to be part of your process to consider that in overall establishment of the new rule amendments?
Sure, yeah, I can take a crack at trying to touch on some of that. So, we do have, I guess to answer your last question, we've got the permit fees that are included are are for recovering those costs associated with the evaluation of those permits. So that's a separate service, right? The application comes in, there's processes associated with evaluating that application, additional, costs depending on whether there's an HRA needed or things of that nature. So those costs that are factored in as part of our regular application fees are separate from the emissions inventory component. You talked about the emission fees, the air contaminant emission fees, and those fees, basically they can be used to help offset costs related to a variety of things associated with permitting, planning, emissions inventory, rule development, things of that nature. As the emission inventory program has grown in size and complexity, more of those emission fees have been allocated to cover some of these program costs. But we also have to tap into other revenue sources as well to cover these costs. And so part of, I think Jack in his comments referenced the audit that we had from the state a few years ago that identified, additional funding sources, primarily DMV funds that have been used to help offset some of these costs, and directed us to shift away from that. And so that's been part of this cost recovery effort as a whole, not only for your what I'll call traditional or standard permitting costs, but other costs that are associated with stationary sources. And so this is kind of continuation of that effort to look at ways to recapture those costs without having to tap into revenue sources like DMV that the state has said should not really be used for this purpose. So to sort of get to I think the gist of your question, part of what we look at is the entirety of revenue sources that we have available to us. And based on that information from the state auditor, try to identify the most appropriate use of those funds. And really there's a limited pool there, right? It's DMV revenue, it's fee revenue. We get some grant revenue to help offset some costs, but aside from that, those are the pools that we have to draw from. And so this effort is really looking at trying to make sure that we can recover those direct expenses wherever we can, and where we do have other revenue sources that theoretically could be used to help offset some of those costs. We're certainly always going to be looking at those to see what we can do to keep things in under control as much as possible. I hope that tries to address some of your questions.
Yes, I also want to just acknowledge I agree with all of Jack's points. And for transparency, another suggestion would be through this rulemaking process, possibly share what kind of costs are you trying to cover and work backwards through labor hours to come up with a fair staff billing time and materials rate. I think the $300 is very concerning, but I think a practical way to do this would be what amount are you trying to cover, and then break it down in a fair way, spread across industry in an equitable manner. Thank you.
You can go ahead. I'm not sure if you're unmuted. It still shows you as muted on our side, Sarah.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for taking the comments, and I support the comments that Neil and Jack both made. I do have a question about that transparency. So is the cost of administering the EIS wrapped into these fees? So for example, is there some sort of flat overhead cost for administering this cost that would be, spread across initially these 3,700 people there or businesses that apply, and then later on to 6,500? So would we expect that to sort of go down over time?
Your question, I think, is regarding cost for EIS, the implementation of the emissions inventory system.
Right.
Yes, and so yes, I think you've got that right. Those costs are spread out as part of overhead across the users of the system, right? And so at this point, as Johnny alluded to, that number is going to grow, and so we would expect, as that number increases, those costs to sort of flatten out as you spread it out across more EIS users, I guess.
Perfect, thank you. And then I would say, I'm going to make one comment, then I'm going to ask a question. So my next comment is really that I would encourage the district to adopt very objective criteria about when somebody's under time and material and when they are under a different format for fees, because obviously some businesses can get smaller and less complex, and others can get big and grow beyond what their original categorization is. And so frankly, you should have an objective and consistent criteria for deciding who's in time and material and who is paying a different fee. So then lastly, my question is, my assumption is our facility is going to be one of the larger ones that's time and material based. So I'd like to understand the logistics or the process for how the fee is presented to us. So for example, would we expect to get a T&M estimate at the same time the district is requesting an emissions inventory? Are we expected to pay that before the inventory is due? And then is there any sort of backstop that can be put in place if the initial T&M estimate is expected to be exceeded? So for example, if you're working through our process and you've given us a fee estimate, and now we expect to exceed that by, let's just say 120% or something like that, is there something that allows you to come back and adjust with us instead of truing up at the end and expecting us to pay without getting an explanation of why we grew beyond that initial estimate? So that's my question. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. And I'll start that off and maybe look to my colleagues if they have anything to add. But I think what we're thinking of is as the requests go out for emissions inventory data, keeping track of labor hours obviously associated with that. I think there's a couple options there. One is we could look at previous year's labor data for your specific facilities to try to use that as an estimate of what costs might be. At this point, I don't think the plan is to request a deposit up front, but rather once the report is complete and any revisions are wrapped up, to invoice at that time, which would probably be typically towards the end of the calendar year, I think. But it sort of speaks to, I think, a question that Jack, or comment that Jack had earlier about if there are opportunities to provide updates throughout the process on kind of where we are in terms of hours. I think that's something that we can certainly look at. I'll look to my colleagues to see if they have anything else to add or any other comments on that particular thing. But I think we see where you're coming from, Sarah, is that the idea is here to get an idea of what the cost will be. And then if we think that cost may change significantly, make sure that there's an opportunity to communicate that, so we're not just, sending a bill at the end of the process.
I can try to add some to Mike, what you said. And Sarah, thank you for your question. That's a good question. And I think as you're very familiar with how we do the process, the permits, especially if the permits have T&M charges, what we do is the initial fee that is paid once that account has been used up, and we start to go over by, you know, significant amount, like $1,000 or more, we do send invoices for additional fees to be added to the account. And I'm just thinking out loud here with the emission fee, we probably would start to do that as well. But right now, you know, our thought is we would get an invoice at the end. But if your recommendation is to get invoices as you go along, I mean, that's something we can take into consideration.
Thank you, Mohsen. It looks like Frank Williamson is next with his hand raised.
Yes, good morning. I put a certain comment in there. None of this sits well with me, and it just seems to me entirely wrong. So I guess I get to be the bad guy and say the nasty things. One of the things that sticks in my head is that we've been talking about the time and material. Noticeable is that over the last 5 to 7 years, their district has actually reduced the number of categories where the fees are being imposed on which kind of specialists. Back in about 2019, I think there were 23 separate categories with 11 different fee schedules. It's all gone down to 5. So I'm looking and saying, why is there suddenly this 180 and creating a new fee schedule? The second part is that mentioning the imposed changes on Rule 19.3. All right, so for 2020, industry-wide, you had 63 pages worth of emissions inventories being generated, and there were 42 entries per page. So doing the math, there are about 2,400 total emissions inventories. I looked at those, a whole lot of them were one category of criteria pollutants and less than a ton. So, and as you've said, with the Lakes program, a lot of those calculations are already happening. So my question is, where's the crisis that's suddenly triggered the need for this rule change? The other part that I think is key is that in Rule 40, you also have the 116 dollars per ton emissions fee. That's been on the books, and it's been that way for at least a decade. And I get to deal with South Coast as well. Their per ton emissions fee is a little more, and they're also more specific. So instead of adding time and material fees for the work that's being done for the emissions inventories, why was there not a look at, okay, let's see about changing that per ton emissions fee instead? Because if we're really talking about the complexity of certain operations, including North Island and Naval Base San Diego, anywhere where there's operations that have more than one permitted source, we might want to look at the emissions fee being modified to reflect inflationary costs as opposed to leaving that the same and instead coming up with an entirely new fee schedule. As an example right now for South Coast, for NOx, the fee is about $585 per ton. That's at least 5 times what's being charged in San Diego. Per ton emissions fee makes more sense, and it can be explained more easily than the idea of the time and material.
Thank you, Mr. Williamson. I think I'll try to touch on a couple of those things, but there's some good points in there that we may want to take back and think about. You talked about the rates in Rule 40, and you're correct. A few years ago, we chose to take those separate, individual classification rates and create blended divisional rates, that look at the group of classifications within a particular division, associate engineer, senior engineer, assistant engineer, and kind of blend those into one rate. And the thought there was that it would make it a little bit more predictable in terms of what rates could be billed to folks. And so that was one change. regarding the emission fee piece, you bring up a good point there. I think there's some complexities there associated with Prop 26 and things of that nature, but that is something that I think maybe we can look at and see what our options are. Part of the rationale behind the T&M fee, as we described, was the fluctuation kind of between costs associated with particular facilities, and there being different levels of effort associated with the work that goes behind the emissions inventory process for those facilities. But I think you bring up something that's worth at least talking about in terms of what the options may be to use that emissions fee and make some changes to that to see what that can do to help offset costs. And I think the second question you had, I may need to ask for some assistance from Junya and the team regarding the kind of historical complexity of emissions inventories and what's changed with these new regulations. So maybe I'll see if one of my colleagues can provide some context there.
Sure, Mike.
Mike, sorry, Junya, go ahead.
No, okay. Mike, yeah, I can hand it off to you too. To touch on the industry-wide piece that you had mentioned. So industry-wide, those are the smaller facilities with usually single sources, as you had mentioned. And those facilities are not currently part of the proposal that we are talking about today. We had mentioned those are the ones that will be phased into the CTR by 2026, and those would be a fixed fee, or we're looking at proposing a fixed fee for those. These are the larger facilities that are not applicable to industry-wide, and also those industry-wide facilities are not changing in AB 2588, but now they're being brought into CTR, which have a lot more data requirements. So the previous requirement was to do those simple calculations, which you saw on our website, and now they become much more complex and a lot more data required on those singular facilities. So that's it, Miney, if you had a comment.
Thank you, Junya. No, I was just going to add that state law requires that we operate on a fee-for-service basis, and so that's what we have in mind. And so in order to make sure that we recover cost, time and material, in this case, it seems to be more appropriate so that we don't overcharge or undercharge facilities. And then as it relates to emission fees, Mike is right that there are some challenges there associated with Prop 26. In addition, some facilities might have lower emissions, but with a lot of complexities because of toxic emissions. So, again, toxics can be, in terms of quantity can be low, but because of the nature of these pollutants, the inventory can be pretty complex. And so that's what the challenge that we have with, emission fees. But certainly we can take this back and look into other options.
Okay, thank you. It looks like Jack, you had your hand up again.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. And I have to apologize. I've got a 10:50 medical appointment that I've got to jump off for. So if I could, I just wanted to leave a comment and then I'd leave you with two questions and I'll go back and listen to the recording to see how you responded. But the first comment is I think obviously we've heard today from so many people going forward that transparency is going to be exceedingly important. And what would really be helpful, it would be if the district could find a method to provide the backup material, the justification, the data for the cost, for the time and materials that that will be presented and charged to these facilities, as has been mentioned. So that's a key takeaway for me today. The two questions I wanted to leave
Jack,
you with.
Let me interrupt you just for a minute because this is really important. I just want to make sure. So your question is regarding specificity as far as the labor rate, right? When you say time and material is really the labor rate that for that $350 something that we have. Is that what you're looking for?
We're concerned about the rate, but we're also concerned about the time and material. What was the time spent on? What part of the process was actually necessary for staff to invest time into, and what was accomplished? That's what our members need to hear.
Okay.
It's like anything else. What am I paying for?
Got it.
Type of thing. So thanks for asking, Miney. The questions are, I just was curious how much money the district actually got in that CARB grant and on how you all intend to apply it. And then The second part is more in-depth question, and that had to do with the legal justification for the district to require the facilities pay the full estimated cost at the time of submission. We know there's a state law that requires that these HRAs be submitted, but we aren't aware of a legal requirement that the full payment be made at that point in time, particularly if there is discussion back and forth needed between the district and the facility to understand what those costs are, as I kind of related to my first question. So, we would think that if a fee was required to be paid, and at submission, a base fee would seem to be more appropriate, such that then any follow-on or additional fees could be there could be some discussion between the district and the facility in terms of what caused those fees and what they were used for and so forth. But the credit for submission would still be applied prior to completing that discussion. By the credit for the submission would still be available to the facility. So again, I'm sorry I have to jump off. Thanks for putting this together today, and I'll look forward to your responses to those.
Thanks, Jack. Yeah, we'll do our best to respond here, and then maybe we can follow up with you if you have questions after the fact, additional clarification. I can certainly answer your first question regarding the CARB grant. It was a one-time grant. I think it was in the neighborhood of $200,000 or $230,000, and that really was used to help offset staff costs for one year basically. So not a huge amount, but every little bit helps. So that was what that particular CARB grant was. Certainly always on the lookout for additional opportunities for funding. Unfortunately with grant funding, oftentimes it's kind of one time, and we know that these costs are going to be ongoing, and so that is driving the desire to look for kind of a sustainable ongoing funding source here. But for that particular grant, that was the dollar amount of what was used for. And then on the question regarding HRA submittals, and deposits up front, that's a little bit out of the scope here, I think, but maybe I'll see if Mohsen or Mayani have maybe a quick answer to that, and maybe that's a conversation we can follow up with Jack on if he has additional questions there. So I wasn't sure if Mohsen or Mayani had anything to add on that.
I just want to quickly add before Jack leaves that one of the things we were being asked by the facilities is that they wanted to get an idea of how much would it cost for us to review or revise or approve the HRA. And they didn't want to get hit with a bill at the end of the process without knowing what the cost of it was up front. So we are giving an estimate, and it is something that if, for example, the review doesn't cost as much, then part of it will be refunded that wasn't used. But if it also goes over that, then there will be additional charges that can be assessed. So it was just to accommodate some of the comments we were getting from the facilities as well.
Thank you, Mohsen. And yeah, if there's additional clarification on that, we can certainly follow up later. Looks like Sterling Ross has his hand up. Sterling, we're not hearing you. It looks like your mic is unmuted, but not hearing anything. Jill, nothing. Maybe we can come back to you, Sterling. Frank Williamson, I wasn't sure, is that a new hand or a legacy hand from previously?
Oh, no, it's new.
Okay.
Thank you again. One of the things, all right, so let's just track this along. The state passed the CTR laws, which from the comment was made that it included quite a few new toxics in theory, which is in turn going to cause a lot more, may trigger more health risk assessments. So right now I'm looking at the public documents for the hotspots, and as of right now, for public notification, there's 9 facilities. And since 2021, when this went into play, has the district had any estimate on the number of these facilities that are getting pulled in that are going to in turn be required to do a full-blown HRA and may in turn have to do public notification? Are there going to be any, or is this going to be a case where a lot of effort is going to be expended and the end result is like the risk, the known risk really hasn't increased?
Well, I can maybe start, and definitely Johnny and Miney, please jump in. Frank, that's a valid question, and I think one of the things, if you look at our annual report, we do report each year how much activities were conducted by the district under their toxic hotspots program. But in general, it's just so that you know, we have had at least 16 facilities that have been subject to public notifications and had to submit risk reduction plans. And of those, we approved 13 of those and have all been implemented. So as long as the implementation is completed and the risks are have fallen below the our Rule 1210 thresholds, then there is no further public notification or public meetings required. Then two caveats here. One is that if they have even submitted a risk reduction plan but have not yet reduced their risk below those thresholds, our rule require annual public notification and potential public meetings. And then secondly, every 4 years, there's a cycle for AB 2588 program that we would look at emission inventories for each facility. It's not all happen in 1 year, so it's like scattered over each year. So every year we look at certain number of those facilities. And if their next cycle emission inventory had emissions that requires a new health risk assessment, then they could be triggered to perform a new health risk assessment. So again, I don't have the numbers, total numbers off the top of my head, but each year we do have a report that goes to our board and public that lists all the facilities subject to notification and risk assessment and risk reduction.
Okay, I am familiar with that because the facility I work for actually gets pulled in. The concern I have is actually more along the lines of, as I said, we have the known biggies who North Island is clearly one of them. There's about 154 separate sources that probably are on the 4-year cycle. And we actually have to submit an emissions inventory every year, regardless of, and then every 4th year we get to play with determining whether our risks have reached the notification and mitigation level. My concern is that of the new ones being discussed, who I don't know if they've actually been included in the whole process or not. It's the, let's see, 1,323 times 2, about 2,446 new sources that I'm guessing are the ones that primarily got pulled in by the CTR. Is there any projection by the district as to how many of them are actually going to get pulled into having to do health risk assessments or public notifications? Because the one thing that I'm trying to put out is that this may be a case where the state has decided they want to do something and it's a bad idea, and there should be some pushback to the state that, not every law that you pass is a good one, and maybe there need to be some laws getting changed.
Hi, Frank. I think I can answer your question about, oh, sorry, Miney.
You go ahead.
Okay. And then I'll hand it off to you. I can at least answer your question on how these facilities have been assessed here in San Diego. They were pulled in through CTR and AB 2588. You had mentioned in your original question, looking both at the CTR regulation and AB 2588. Definitely suggest to do that because they were created in a way that mirror each other. So they look very similar. If it's pulled into one, we have assessed them for AB 2580 as well. I don't have specific numbers in terms of those that have entered the program or that have prioritization scores, only because they are currently under assessment. So the amendments were for 21. The first full data year was 22, collected in 23. Given the process of prioritization scores and then proceeding to HRA and then possibly proceeding to public notification, we are still in the draft process for most of that. I can say that facilities have been brought into AB 2588, prioritized above the risk thresholds, and brought in to require an HRA because of these amendments. We don't know the exact final number yet because we're still working through that process.
So I think some of this discussion is a little bit outside the scope of this workshop, but we certainly are open to connect offline to further discuss this. But there are exemptions in both Rule 1210, which is our hotspots rule, as well as state law. For a lot of these facilities, they are subject to emission inventory requirements. And so a lot of those facilities would not be required to conduct health risk assessments. We call industry-wide facilities, and there's a specific exemption in our rule. So we're not really concerned about that at this moment. But as I said, we certainly are open to connect to discuss other topics. But this is a little bit outside the scope of this workshop.
Great, thank you, Janya and Miney. I see a message from Neil Davenport. Sounds like you have another question.
It's just really quick. I would think this is a budgeting question for a lot of facilities. Who would the right person be, and how soon could facilities approach the district to get some historical labor data for maybe the last 1 or 2 years of emission inventory processing, with the early assumption that there'll be a time and materials cost? You've got a rough rate. I think people are going to want to do some math. Can they request some of that historical labor data now, or when would the district maybe be able to respond to such requests, and who would we go to?
Janya, maybe I'll turn to you. I think we have data, right, over the last, I don't know how many years, facility specific data, right, that we could share that to kind of give folks an idea of what costs they may be looking at based on historical numbers. Again, I think the caveat there is could change going forward depending on the amount of work associated with that. But we may be able to provide some of that. I don't know. I'll see what Janya and Miney have to say.
Yeah,
just
definitely caveat.
We have labor data, and I'll let Janya address that. But as Janya mentioned before, this program is evolving, right? EIS is it's expanding. Also, we've been publishing emission calculations on our website to increase transparency, so facilities know, in the very beginning of, what type of emission calculation we're going to be conducting. And, EIS is conducting those calculations. And so basically the program is evolving, and we are hoping to continue to evolve to decrease the time it takes to prepare those inventories. So looking at the labor data, which we have, might not give you a clear picture as far as what the future is going to be. In fact, we don't want it to be, because we want it to continue to streamline, this process as we continue to work on EIS, and we will continue to work with facilities to convey the expectation as to how to provide that data to us to further streamline the process.
Yeah, I'll add on to what Miney has said, is that we do have that labor data, but EIS has created the valuations to be much more efficient than they have in previous years, which is the goal. So looking at that labor data will be definitely different than what is expected now that these efficiencies are in place. So although we track it, I'm not sure. I'll leave it up to Mike and Miney and Mosin on how that would be communicated, but it definitely does not accurately represent what we expect the charges to be now that EIS is working as we expect it will.
It leads me to think labor hours are going to go down. I think industry's first reaction is there's unknown about the worry that it could actually go up. So I think it just gives us some kind of boundary, I think, speaking for industry. Who would we extend that request to? It would be you, Janya, for labor data?
I'm going to leave that up to Miney to
So I would recommend to contact Molson for that, and then we can evaluate depending on what your request looks like. Again, the goal is to decrease the labor data as we try to streamline this process. The other thing is to that can add to the labor data is a request for revisions. And so I think that if in the very beginning of this process, the district and industry have a pretty clear idea as to, what we're asking for and what we need to conduct these emission calculations, that can certainly streamline the process. But, to answer your question, I would contact Molson with any requests you have as relates to inventories.
Thank you.
All right. Wanted to see if we had any other questions or comments. I see Frank Williamson, I see your hands up again. I wasn't sure if that's a new question or
No, Mike, I think it's just legacy.
okay.
I'm just going to have to, I'm done with my comments for today.
Okay, thank you. Wanted to see if there's any other questions or comments that folks have now. Like we said, certainly opportunities to reach out to us after the workshop in advance of September or even at the September board workshop. So please feel free to connect with us. You can send an email to our fiscal inbox here, and we'll make sure it gets to the right folks. Or reach out to us with any other questions or comments that you may have. So kind of give it the going once, going twice. Not seeing any more hands raised or comments in the chat at this point. I think we will go ahead and close out the workshop. Again, thank you everybody for taking your time today and providing your feedback. Lots of good comments and good information for us to consider and think about as we look at this proposal going forward. So really appreciate the collaborative work environment and discussions and look forward to continuing conversations. So, and this, I think this website, our workshop is going to be recorded and posted up on our website as well. So if you wanted to go back to it and refer to it, it'll be available. And stay tuned for additional notices and additional information as we approach September. Thanks, everybody. Hope you have a good rest of your afternoon.